Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about something really important, but something that people don't really want to engage with because it is a bit more complex than we would like to believe. Living wages. My name is Pallavi Sharma, and I'm a senior legal advisor and the agriculture sector lead with Global Rights Compliance. We are a law and development agency headquartered in the Netherlands, and we basically work with private and public sector stakeholders to design and implement human rights and environmental due diligence. And we also work on investigation of human rights violations, including of wages with companies. So today I have the privilege to be joined on this panel by Alok from Ethical Trading Initiative and Meher from the Wage Indicator Foundation. I'm sure most of you in this room already know about these two wonderful organizations, but just to give you a quick overview. So the Ethical Trading Initiative is an alliance of companies, trade unions, and voluntary organizations and works globally to improve working conditions for people in the upstream segments of the supply chain. And Alok here is the regional director of the South Asia office and has tons of experience on working on living wages, especially across apparel, textile, and natural stone sectors. The Wage Indicator Foundation is a global independent nonprofit organization that collects, compares, and shares information on minimum wages, and living incomes, and also builds programmatic interventions on evidence that they collect. Here, Meher is the specialist in global wage mapping and living wage analysis, and she brings the critical expertise in this room to actually understand what this living wage methodology is and how can we reach this number across different geographical and sectoral contexts. So today in this session, as you know, it's a short session. So you would notice that there are two themes running across different speeches. One, we would like to discuss what are the choke points or the big, in terms of the resistance to living wage uptake in Asia. What is stopping us from getting there? Yes, the answer could be obvious for some of you, but then this is something that we would like to pick up from our respective spheres of work. Second, and this is a really important bit, we would like to focus on the positive incremental steps and actions that are being taken to sort of move the needle to the positive direction. It's not perfect. And as you would hear from the speakers today, that these are small steps, pilots, ideologies, ideas that are being experimented with. But these are the steps which are concrete and have actually started to show some result or are likely to show some positive result in terms of living wages in the future. So also a quick note, this is a snap session, so unfortunately we wouldn't have time for the Q&A at the end of it, but I request you to please continue your conversations with the panelists if there is something that interests you from this discussion, or if there are ideas that you would like to bounce around. I can speak for the three of us. We love to talk, and we will continue talking. All right, so without further ado, let's start with you, Alok. So my first question to you is that in your experience of working in South Asia, what has been the biggest resistance to the uptake of living wage?
Yeah, thanks. Living wage, again, it's an issue which we have been discussing, debating for many, many years. And we are still, exactly where we have been, I would say a decade back. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we see is somehow in most of these sourcing countries, more than living wage, it is the minimum wage which drives the whole wage agenda. So at every workplace, if you see, the motivation is to pay minimum wages. And suppliers would probably be saying that, we have been paying our workers minimum wages as such. But if you look at the minimum wage, which was created as a flow, that given the demand and supply, the wage should not fall below a particular level, and that was the intention of the policymakers when they were actually looking at minimum wages. But what has happened that minimum wages, rather than being a floor, it has become a ceiling. And that's the aspiration for every employer, that they want to reach that ceiling of minimum wage. And when you're talking about living wage, somehow that, living wage is above that, ceiling on, on the top floor, and somehow we are trying to get through the roof. And that's the problem. We have stuck the roof and we are trying to hit through the roof to achieve living wage. And many a times, what we are doing is shorter approaches. We are trying to drill through the ceiling to go onto the roof. Now that is not going to happen. That is either going to collapse the entire roof, or you'll have so many holes that will be leaking during the rainy season. So somewhere we are not looking at the staircase that can take us to the roof where, you know, once we have hit the minimum wage ceiling, we need to go onto the roof. And for going onto the roof, we need to have staircases, we need to have steps in place. And somewhere we have actually, damaged the whole steps, I would say, by creating structures which certainly uh, damages the whole process of arriving at living wages as such. Now look at what are some of the factors that helps or would have helped in terms of achieving living wages. Uh, and they have become a challenge for us today. We are not getting a good employment practices in place. Look at the recruitments that are happening. Now, more and more, we are moving towards informalization. More and more permanent workers are being, replaced by contractual workers, daily wage workers, or somewhere, you have people working on piece rates. Now, these are not sustainable when we come to, living wage aspirations. So somewhere we need to look at what some of the practices that we need to have in place to have living wages in place. Uh, for us, somewhere, that ladder should have been from minimum wage to a fair wage, which can only be achieved looking at the industry's capacity to pay, plus a collective bargaining being in place. And in order for us to have collective bargaining in place, what we need is freedom of association, workers coming together. Now, if you have more and more informal workers, naturally, they would not be able to come together because that will be seen as a threat, and then the employers may, in fact, let them off or terminate them or ask the contractors to move them from one factory to the other. So somewhere the steps that should have been in place or that we should be working on, we are completely missing on that aspect, rather than we are trying to, somehow get into whole calculation and, driving that how do we achieve. But then we are not looking at all the steps that should have been in place in order for us to achieve living wages and such. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alok. If I could also ask you one sort of to give a comment on if there is an advice that you would like to give to businesses who want to do living wage but may have constraints in terms of costs
Mhm.
or competition, what would that be?
See, again, cost is something which would always, come at the forefront. And somewhere we also need to understand as companies that how some of these practices where, workers not getting a living wage is driving them towards vulnerabilities is very, very important. And that's where, we need to have those empirical data to be shared with the companies as to what happens, when workers are not getting the right kind of wages as such. Uh, as ETI, we commissioned a research study across three countries in South Asia: India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, basically to look at how lower wages actually drive vulnerability among workers, and especially among poor women workers or workers from vulnerable communities. Now, challenge is, or if you look at some of the findings that came out of this piece of research, uh, we found, and this is again, which most of us know, that the current wages are far, far, lesser than what a living wage should be. Second is that somewhere there is a lack of knowledge in terms of what should be the living wage for that particular area, and suppliers are clearly unaware that what wage that they should also be negotiating with their buyers as such. Then there is a clear gender gap that we have found across all three countries. And then because of the wage, which is much, much lower, there are social impacts which already also are intertwined. We have seen that there are issues with regard to decent housing. In fact, a couple of years back, I had personally done assessment around some of the cluster in Delhi, in India, where we found out that every time there is an increase in minimum wage, there is also an incremental increase in the rents. So then, somewhere many a times you will realize that workers actually end up losing more money by every wage increase. Now, that is not sustainable. So somewhere, whenever these industrial clusters have been, constructed, uh, policymakers really forgot about worker accommodations. Now, if a worker is getting a incremental wage, and if the landlords are increasing their utility costs, because they also have to pay for their electricity to the landlord, and their rental income, ultimately, they'll end up losing money, and that really drives them to take up another, work, or work excessive hours to compensate the lower wages as such. Then we have seen poor nutrition across, all these countries, that given the low wages that they have, the kind of food that they are taking is not nutritious, which is again leading to some of the health issues which are again attached to it. Given again lower wages, their expenses around health is also challenging. Somewhere again, every time somebody would fall uh, sick, or they need to be hospitalized, they would have to depend on money lenders to borrow money, and then again get into that cycle of debt as such. And then again, that whole debt repayment then further accentuates the available money that they have at their disposal as such. If you look at the study from Pakistan, which GRC was involved, uh, we have found out that female workers were having more shorter duration jobs, and more female workers, they were working on piece rate systems. And then the income disparities were really, really high, and the wages that they were getting was much below the living wage, which is again, if you look at the overall Pakistan living wage of 55,000, they were getting somewhere closer to 38 or 36,000 every month. And then when you have, piece rate workers, naturally they would be devoid of all statutory benefits. So permanent workers would be, entitled to a lot of statutory benefits, but then when it comes to informal worker or piece rate workers, they would not be getting that, and again that adds to their vulnerability as such. Again, a large number of workers were living in semi-permanent houses, which were dangerous, risky, and it's largely because of the low wages that they had. Food security, major issue. Education of children, again, given the low income that they have, they would not be able to pay school fees, and somehow the dropout rates are very, very high. So somewhere we have seen that low wages really accentuates vulnerability of the workers as such, and these data, uh, is something that we need to share with the brands, that when they are negotiating with the suppliers, and suppliers should also be using this to negotiate further with their bias when it comes to the wages for the workers. Thank you.
Thank you, Alok. This research was very telling, and it's nothing that we didn't know, but a lot that we didn't want to acknowledge. There are still systemic issues that we've been working on for years. For example, as he said, gender. Gender basically runs across everything in most sectors, especially textiles. So this was a very interesting piece of evidence. This brings me to you, Meher. We have evidence. We have discovered that there are a lot of problems, but we also understand that dollar is what drives every conversation. So, what has been Wage Indicator's way of actually convincing suppliers to get on board with living wages? Because you have been doing that quite successfully.
Yeah, so maybe I can start off a little about wage indicators. So basically, we've curated a methodology for calculating living wages, and we've partnered with universities, trade unions, and other competing organizations to work around and come up with a living wage methodology. And we have estimates now for about over 180 countries and over 3,000 regions within them. And how we work is use these estimates as a starting point for negotiations and sort of figuring out how, be it suppliers or brands, can figure out how living wages, where they stand, and use it to negotiate with and work together to come up with strategies for implementing it. And if you talk about, for instance, just to sort of echo maybe what Alok was talking about earlier, you see that minimum wages, for instance, which were probably intended as a floor, are now being relied upon as a ceiling. And what we also see from our work with, minimum wages data that we've curated over the years and put together, we've seen that minimum wages, one, they're not being updated. And a lot of places, when they are in fact updated, they are merely updated in line with inflation. And it doesn't really sort of reflect the actual cost of living on ground. We also see that companies, while accommodating with this fact, they also have to work in countries where there is no regulation, for instance, on living wages, or um, you don't have essentially principles or guidelines in order to how to implement living wages. Where do we start? How do we get there? And things like that. So in this global context, when we work with, be it suppliers or brands, it's always a very tricky conversation when you're thinking about implementing living wages. It seems extremely complicated. It seems very context specific. So maybe from our work that we've been doing majorly with garment brands, with in the pharmaceutical sector, a little bit, we've also started out with palm oil suppliers. And what we've observed is that there are, whenever you talk about living wage implementation, there's obviously, what should be done, but there's also a bunch of, sort of hindrances or choke points which everyone sort of, you know, um, comes to face. And then you have to, what we try to do with the brands or the suppliers that we work with is that sort of help them preempt these hindrances or these choke points and start conversation early on. So what we've seen is that oftentimes for brands and suppliers, living wage seems like an expensive ordeal, or it's just going to be very taxing to sort of start thinking about living wages. But then what we do is we always tell them to start with data. When you have data on what living wage actually is for that particular region, you can start the conversation or have a context specific understanding of where you stand vis-a-vis the living wage. So a lot of times we've seen that the difference between actual wages and living wages may be lower in certain parts of a certain regions, which can be a very interesting starting point to start closing the gap in some places and gradually move on to places where the gap is higher. Then a lot of times, because estimates can be complex, can be varied, different providers maybe have slightly different numbers, brands tend to obsess over the number and figure out and forget that in the goal is not to obsess over a number or close the gap based on that number, because living wage is a moving target. It changes with cost of living patterns. So rather than obsessing over the number, what you should ideally be doing is use that as a starting point for negotiation and not fret upon what actually the number sort of is or where it's heading. There's also another issue that we often face: if the right people are not at the table from the beginning, that sooner or later you're going to run into issues. For instance, if the top management or leadership is not at the table, or they are not deeply engaged in living wage practices, then even if, or if specific teams are themselves, engaged, but they are not talking to each other. For instance, if the procurement or the sustainability teams are not talking to each other and working together to implement living wages, it is sooner or later bound to run into problems. There's also the issue of, the fear of being the first mover in a particular field, that, our competing brands, are the suppliers in our region are not working on living wages. Why should we be the first ones? Or there's a fear of retaliation when brands think about living wages. There's a fear of retaliation from suppliers, or be it, what if they interpret it as, lower margins, and there are a lot of risks associated with it. But then there's also the flip side to it, that you can always collaborate and work together and share the responsibility. And what we try to do is create an environment or facilitate discussions between both suppliers as well as the brand, in order to be able to work together and figure out strategies that ensure that neither of them is, feeling like they have to share the burden, or take the burden onto themselves. And finally, what we also see is oftentimes suppliers are manufacturing for multiple brands. And for instance, if one brand is keen on implementing living wages while others are not as keen, it often runs into problems. So what we try to do is engage with suppliers from the very beginning, and try to get other brands that are, that the supplier is manufacturing for, engaged in the conversation from the start about living wages, so that at some point both different brands can share the responsibility and close the gap for that particular supplier. And maybe I'd like to sort of end with some broad, action points that we feel really work in, starting the conversation on living wages, and, making it easier for suppliers and brands to talk about it. So when we think of living wages, rather than framing it as a number issue, or as a, that you need to close the gap based on this number, you can always reframe the conversation as a cost of living conversation. You can also talk about how, at some point we want that, minimum wage should in fact become the living wage. Minimum wage should be all encompassing. They should have full coverage, such that, they in fact ensure that, all factories are complying with in fact a living wage, and not just the minimum wage. And when you use, for instance, minimum wage, living wage as a starting point for these conversations, you can, from the beginning, you can start off with a collaborative, shared responsibility approach, work together, and rather than complicating the whole process and fretting over one or 2 points, just try to see it as a long journey where you can step by step incrementally get to the goal, rather than doing it in like a one shot, one time approach. What we do is that we share dashboards with simulations, so that, we show brands that if you try to close the gap with 1 year with this wage increment percentage, how is it going to look like? And then we always show them that, you can see it as a long term strategy, a 4-year strategy, 5-year strategy, so that the number that you have to start closing for the first year, for instance, is not that huge. So it always puts them at ease that, we don't have to close the gap today. There's always time. It's always a long-term approach that you have to see, as that's how you should see it. So yeah, that's probably where I would like to close off. There's always scope to leverage. There's always plus points and minus points in this process. You can leverage the things that work for you, and then work together to fix the issues that you come across here and there. And it's always easier to go ahead with a strategy where you're not overcomplicating things, but just working together and trying to find a solution.
Thank you, Mayor. That's actually wonderfully positive, because we just stress on why you don't have to do everything right now, which is a very important facet of human rights due diligence. You're not expected to achieve everything perfectly all at once, but you take incremental steps. And actually, what you said about collaboration, this is critical, because right now, our reality is that we don't have a law that will bind all the companies under the same obligation of paying living wages. So what happens is that in the absence of this legal certainty, say if an SME, a small company wants to pay living wages without any adjustments to their purchase prices, they will likely run their business into the ground because their competitor is not paying living wages. So this is the reality that we're dealing with, which generally happens because there is legal and policy uncertainty. When I was thinking about this, I realized that this idea of living wages is not new by any stretch. It's just that we are talking about it more now. But you can trace it as far back to ILO's 1919 constitution, which I found out yesterday, by the way. The 1919 constitution then said that everyone should be paid a reasonable standard of wages, and we are in 2025, so something for us to think about. Also, 1966, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights clearly said that the wages should be such that workers can support themselves and their families for a decent living. So we've just been going over these concepts, changing the terminology, but it has been around for a long time. With CSDDD, admittedly, the conversation has started to change a little bit. Yes, it's an imperfect law. Yes, absolutely, it misses the voices of people that it is eventually trying to help in the upstream segments of the supply chains. But that said, I would still like to acknowledge the importance of this law in terms of living wages. This is the first statute of this scale that actually says that living wages is a human right, and companies have to adjust their purchasing practices to effectuate living wages in their supply chain. And for all of you who have been following the omnibus, I personally feel extremely disappointed with what's happening. But the reality is, with the omnibus proposal, the sections, the recitals, and annexes on living wages have not been disturbed much. So, in substance, what the CSDDD is saying about living wages and protection by companies, it remains the same. Just that now the companies are only looking at their direct business partners in business as usual, and only looking at their indirect business partners if there is a credible evidence of harm or a violation in that supply chain. So there is still an opportunity to get companies to look deeper, just that the onus now is on civil society partners, on watchdogs, to bring this credible evidence to light should the Omnibus 2 get passed when the negotiations open in October. So this is the general scene setting. I do want to stress that even in its very diluted, unfortunate form, it would still be a big piece of legislation in terms of setting a legal precedent on the living wage issue. So to that effect, it's still a decent piece of work. Now, I want to basically take a moment here and say that we really don't need to wait for this law to actually take actions. Understandably, setting minimum wages itself is so complicated. And Meher and I were talking about this, that there are sectors, there are regions, there are geographies, there are sourcing models that determine what exactly gets paid to the workers. It should not be, but this is a reality that we are living in. Without this as well, there are a lot of policy levers that we can pick up to take these, again, incremental steps. One of them that I want to talk about is the public policy lever of public procurement. So about 10 to 15% of the GDP goes in public procurement. So technically, government is the biggest buyer in the country. So if we make it a principle that no public money is going to fund poverty wages, and all public procurement tenders are tied to payment of fair wages or living wages or whatever the agreed upon standard is, which is definitely above the fledgling minimum wages that we keep saying, that will ensure that all the tenders are awarded only to people who are serious about this. So this is one way to actually get the biggest buyer to set the industry standard benchmark of the wages that should be paid to the workers. There are also some really interesting examples of this already happening. For example, in Finland, their public procurement authority, it awards extra points to bidders who work on living wages. So on top of your bid, if you're working on living wages and you can establish that, then you get awarded extra points that increases the chances of your tender getting through. Similarly, the courts, when it comes to public procurement, they also look at this issue quite seriously. I found an example from Ireland from 2024, actually, it's fairly recent, where the court saw that the bid which was awarded was suspiciously low compared to industry standards. So they went digging, and obviously they found out that the labor costs that had been put in the bid were much, much below the acceptable industry standards at that point, and that award was cancelled by the court. So these are some of the mechanisms that are already existing, which are being applied and can be considered to be applied to improve incrementally the situation of bringing the living wages closer to the floor and not to the ceiling where they stand at the moment. So in the ideal world, they would be closer to the floor of the wages that everyone is being paid right now. So yeah, this is basically what I wanted to talk about to all of you today. That There are problems with public procurement. For example, more often than not, it only extends to the contractor and not to the subcontractors. And we know that subcontractors may have several issues flowing down, but imperfect systems in which we are operating. And the theme of this session, we agreed, was incremental steps. So as Alok says, that it is not a shot to the top, it is a ladder step by step. And every public procurement policy that involves living wages, every evidence that is built to convince suppliers that it is not a big change for them and they just have to incrementally reach the certain level in 5 years or to 6 years. And every research that is built to really shed light on what is happening and how systemic issues such as freedom of association, gender, the actual issues that actually cause the lack of wages that basically flows into a sort of all sorts of decent work violations, taking this to companies and getting them to basically set their house straight, that is an incremental step that we can take. With this, I'm going to stop. We actually have 2 minutes. So if anybody has any burning questions for the panel, this would be a good time for us to take. Wonderful. Seems like we've convinced all of you really, really well today.
Thanks.
Then thank you so much. With this, we close off this session. You've been a very wonderful audience. And yeah, we would love to continue this conversation off.
If either of you are interested in checking out the methodology that we use for calculation of living wage, I've just dropped by some flyers on the table right here. If you were